The dust of Deadwood doesn't just settle on your clothes, it settles in your soul. It's a place where fortunes are dug from the mud, and men's lives are worth less than the color in their pan. For Elara Vance, fleeing a scandal that had shattered her life in civilized Philadelphia, this godless town in the heart of the Dakota Territory was both a prison and a hiding place. She carried a secret she believed had marked her forever, a stain of shame in a world that demanded purity from women. But in this savage land, she would meet two men, one who saw her as a prize to be owned, and another, a Lakota warrior who saw the truth of her spirit through the lies she told herself. This is not a story of a damsel in distress. This is the story of a woman's fight for her soul and the unexpected love that taught her what true acceptance means. The stagecoach rattled into Deadwood like a dying beast, coughing dust and groaning on its leather straps. Elara Vance clutched the worn handle of her valise, her knuckles white. Every jolt seemed to echo the violent upheaval of her life, the lurch from the polished society of Philadelphia to this raw, bleeding edge of the world. Deadwood wasn't a town. It was a wound in the earth, carved into the sacred Pahasapa of the Lakota. Mud, thick and greedy, sucked at the boardwalks. The air, thin and sharp with the scent of pine, was fouled by the stench of cheap whiskey, unwashed bodies, and the acrid smoke from her uncle's smithy somewhere down the gulch. Her father's words, cold and clipped, still rang in her ears. "You have brought ruin upon the Vance name, Elara. Your Uncle Jacob will take you in. Perhaps the harshness of the frontier will scour this indiscretion from your character." Indiscretion. That was the word he'd used for what Alistair Croft had done. A man of wealth and power, a suitor her father had courted for the family's benefit. Croft, with his soft hands and predatory eyes, had cornered her in the conservatory during the autumn gala. He had whispered promises, while his hands had trespassed his actions, leaving a deeper scar than any physical blow. When she had fought, he had torn her dress. When she had cried out, he had muffled her scream. Later, when her tearful confession had been met with disbelief, Croft had simply smiled and painted her as a hysterical, wanton girl who had thrown herself at him. Society, ever eager for a scandal, had devoured the lie. She was ruined. Now, stepping into the Deadwood mud, her fine city boots immediately sinking, Elara felt the weight of that ruin like a physical shroud. Men stopped and stared, not with the polite admiration she had once known, but with a raw, assessing hunger. They were prospectors, gamblers and cutthroats, their faces burnt by the sun and etched with avarice. In their eyes, she was fresh meat. Her Uncle Jacob Vance was waiting. A mountain of a man, his face was kind, but weary, his huge hands permanently stained with soot. He didn't embrace her. He just took her bag, his gaze full of a pity that stung more than scorn. "It's a hard place, Ellie," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Keep your eyes down and your mouth shut. It's safer that way." He led her past the saloons, where tinny piano music and rough laughter spilled out into the street. A man stumbled out of the Gem Theatre, his eyes landing on Elara. He was well dressed for this town, in a tailored black coat and a clean Stetson. His face was handsome in a cruel way, with a sharp jaw and pale, calculating eyes. He blocked their path, a smirk playing on his lips. "Well now, Jacob," the man drawled, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Didn't know you were importing angels. What's your name, sweetheart?" "This is my niece, Silas." Jacob said, his body tensing as he stepped between them. "She's here to help me. We've got work to do." The man Silas Blackwood didn't move. He owned the biggest saloon and held the claims to half the profitable mines in the area. In Deadwood, That made him a king. His eyes roamed over Ilara, stripping her bare. A pretty thing like her shouldn't be hammering iron. She belongs somewhere soft. My place, for instance. Ilara felt a familiar, cold dread creep up her spine. It was the same look Alistair Croft had given her. The look of a man who sees a thing he wants and has never been denied. She flinched, pulling her shawl tighter. Silas laughed, a short, ugly sound. Spirited. I like that. He finally stepped aside, but his gaze followed them all the way to the blacksmith shop at the end of the street. The smithy was a cavern of fire and shadow. It was a man's world, and Ilara felt profoundly out of place. Jacob gave her a small room in the back, little more than a closet with a cot. As she unpacked her few remaining dresses, the fine fabrics seemed to mock the rough-hewn walls. She was a bird with broken wings, caged in a land of wolves. That evening, unable to bear the confines of her room, she stepped outside behind the smithy. The sun was setting, painting the jagged peaks of the Black Hills in hues of blood and gold. The noise of the town was a dull roar behind her. It was then that she saw him. He was standing near the edge of the woods that encroached upon the town, watching the sunset. He wasn't a settler. He was Lakota. Tall and lean, with hair as black as a raven's wing, falling in 2 long braids over his shoulders. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple tunic, and he stood with a stillness that seemed to defy the chaos of the nearby town. He wasn't armed, at least not visibly, and he held a single eagle feather in his hand. He turned his head slowly, as if sensing her presence. Their eyes met across the 50 yards of trampled earth. His gaze was unlike any she had ever encountered. It wasn't hungry like Silas Blackwood's or pitying like her uncle's. It was calm, deep and steady like the ancient hills themselves. It held no judgment, only a quiet, unnerving intensity. He seemed to see right through the shame she wore past the scandal to the frightened girl huddled beneath. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She should have been afraid. Every story she'd ever heard painted his people as savages. But in his eyes, for the first time since arriving, she didn't feel like a ruined woman. She just felt seen. A shutter slammed somewhere in the town, breaking the spell. She gasped and hurried back inside, her back pressed against the rough wood of the door. Her hand went to her throat, her breath coming in ragged bursts. The look from Silas Blackwood had made her feel sullied. The look from the Lakota stranger had made her feel real. And in a town like Deadwood, she couldn't decide which was more dangerous. The days that followed bled into a routine of grueling, unfamiliar labor. Ilara learned to work the bellows, her arms aching with a fatigue that seeped into her bones. She learned to mend harnesses, her fingers once accustomed to embroidery needles, growing calloused from the thick leather and waxed thread. The work was a blessing. It left little room for thought for the haunting memories of Alistair Croft's treachery. Her uncle Jacob was a patient, if silent, teacher. He spoke little of her past, his unspoken rule being that what happened back east stayed there. But the shadow of it lingered, coloring every interaction. Silas Blackwood became a constant, unwelcome presence. He would saunter by the smithy, tipping his hat to Ilara with an insolent grin, his eyes always promising things that made her stomach clench. He sent her gifts a bolt of silk. She couldn't possibly use a bottle of French perfume, whose scent was an obscenity in the gritty air. She refused them all, sending them back, with a polite but firm note. Each refusal only seemed to fuel his determination. He's a patient man when he wants something. Ellie... Jacob warned her one evening, his face grim in the firelight as he hammered a glowing horseshoe. And he's not used to being told no. Be careful. Her only respite was in the brief moments she could steal away, wandering to the edge of the woods behind the shop. It was there she saw the Lakota man again, and again. He never approached her directly, but his presence was a quiet constant. She learned his name from the fearful whispers of the townsfolk, Chaitin they called him, which meant Falcon. They said he was a scout, a loner who walked between worlds but belonged to neither. Some spat his name with contempt. Others spoke of his uncanny ability to track, to read the land as if it were an open book. One afternoon, a delivery wagon lost a wheel in a deep rut just outside town. The driver, a florid-faced man named Peterson, was cursing a blue streak. Jacob was laid up with a fever, and Elara knew she had to fetch the spare parts. She took one of the pack mules, a stubborn creature named Clementine, and headed out. The woods were deeper and more disorienting than they looked. After retrieving the heavy iron fittings, she tried to take a shortcut back. Within minutes, the familiar sounds of Deadwood faded, replaced by the whispering of pines and the chatter of unseen creatures. Panic began to set in. Clementine, sensing her fear, planted her feet and refused to move. "Please!" Elara begged the mule, tugging on the reins. "Please, we have to go back." A twig snapped behind her. She whirled around her heart, leaping into her throat. It was Chaitin. He stepped silently from behind a massive ponderosa pine, his movements as fluid as smoke. "You are lost," he said. It was not a question. His voice was low and calm, holding none of the guttural cadence she'd expected from the dime novels she'd read. It was simply a voice. I was just taking a shortcut," she stammered, feeling foolish. He looked at the sun, then at the moss on the trees. "This path leads deeper into the hills. The town is that way." He pointed in the opposite direction. He walked toward the mule. Clementine, who had fought Elara at every turn, stood perfectly still, allowing him to stroke her neck. He murmured something in his own language, a soft, musical sound. The mule's ears flickered and she nudged his hand. "She trusts you," Elara said, amazed. "Animals do not lie," Chaitin replied, his dark eyes meeting hers. "They know a friend. They know a threat." The implication hung in the air between them. He led the way back, not speaking again, until they could see the grimy rooftops of Deadwood through the trees. He walked with an economy of motion, his moccasins making no sound on the pine-needle floor. Elara, struggling with the mule, and the heavy parts felt clumsy and loud in comparison. "Why do you come to the edge of the town?" she asked, her curiosity overriding her caution. They don't like your people here." He stopped and turned to her. "This land was our church before it became your market. I come to remember what it was before the gold sickness poisoned it." His gaze swept over the town, a flicker of profound sadness in his eyes. "And I watch. The Wasichu, the white man, is a strange creature. He takes more than he needs and calls it progress." "I'm not like them," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I didn't come here for gold." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "I know." He stopped at the tree line, gesturing for her to go on. "You are safe from here." "Thank you," she said, genuinely grateful. "My name is Elara Vance." "I know," he said again, and the way he said it sent a shiver through her. He had not just learned her name. He had observed her, understood something of her. "I am Chaitin." As she led the mule back to the smithy, the weight of the iron parts seemed lighter. The brief conversation had been a drink of cool water in a parched desert. But when she entered the town proper, she saw Silas Blackwood leaning against a post outside his saloon, watching her emerge from the woods. His eyes narrowed, and the pleasant smirk was gone, replaced by a look of cold possession. He had seen her with Chaitin, The fragile connection she had just forged suddenly felt like a lit fuse. In Deadwood, an act of kindness from a Lakota man to a white woman was not seen as kindness. It was a transgression, and Silas Blackwood was a man who collected the debts of every transgression, real or imagined. The whispers in the pines had ended, but Ilara had a terrible feeling that the shouting was about to begin. The town's mood toward Ilara shifted overnight. It was a subtle poison seeping into every interaction. The shopkeeper who had been civil now served her in stony silence. The women who had offered furtive, pitying smiles now turned their backs. Silas Blackwood had spread the word, twisting the simple act of Chayton, guiding her from the woods into something sordid and shameful. Jacob Vance's niece, meeting the savage in secret. The rumor was a stain more potent and immediate than the one she had carried from Philadelphia. Silas himself grew bolder. He no longer waited outside the smithy. He came in his polished boots, scuffing the dirt floor, his presence sucking the air from the room. He would lean against the anvil, making pointed remarks about Indian lovers, while Jacob's hammer rang with furious, impotent rage. "A woman's reputation is a delicate thing, Jacob," Silas said one afternoon, examining his clean fingernails, while Ilara tried to ignore him. "Especially out here. Once it's muddied, well, it's hard to get clean. She might find herself with no one to turn to, except perhaps a man who is forgiving." "Get out of my shop, Blackwood," Jacob growled, his knuckles white around the hammer's handle. Silas just smiled. "I'm always willing to help a lady in distress. Tell your niece to remember that." The pressure on Jacob was immense. Men who owed Silas money suddenly found other blacksmiths. Shipments of coal and iron that Jacob had ordered were lost or delayed. They were being slowly choked, and Ilara knew she was the reason. The guilt was a heavy stone in her gut. "This is my fault," she told her uncle one night, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I should leave." Jacob stopped his work, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a grimy hand. His face was etched with exhaustion. "And go where Ellie back east to a father who cast you out into the wilderness alone. No, you're a Vance. We don't run." His words were meant to be strong, but she heard the tremor of fear beneath them. The breaking point came on a Saturday night. Jacob had gone to play a few hands of poker, a rare escape for him. Ilara was finishing a mending job when the doors of the smithy were thrown open. It was Silas, and he was drunk. With him were two of his lackeys, big, brutish miners named Flint and Cutter. "Working so late, little bird," Silas slurred, advancing on her. The smell of whiskey was overpowering. "I've come to collect a dance." "Please leave me alone," Ilara said, backing away until she hit the cold stone of the forge. "Oh, I'll leave you alone," Silas sneered, his face contorting with ugly resentment. "After you give me what you so freely give that redskin buck in the woods?" The insult was so vile, so far from the quiet respect Chayton had shown her, that a surge of fury cut through her fear. "You are a disgusting animal," she spat. Silas's eyes went cold. He lunged, grabbing her arm. His grip was like iron. "I'll teach you some manners." Ilara screamed, a raw, terrified sound. She struggled, but he was too strong. Flint and Cutter just laughed, blocking the doorway. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the entrance. A figure moved with impossible speed and silence. It was Chayton. He hadn't come from the street, but from the darkness behind the building, as if summoned by her cry. In his hand was a knife, its blade gleaming in the firelight. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His eyes fixed on Silas were burning with a cold, lethal fire. "Get your hand off her," Chayton said, his voice deadly calm. Silas, momentarily stunned, let out a harsh laugh. "Look what we have here. The brave has come for his squaw. It's 3 against 1 Indian." "The odds do not matter," Chayton said, taking a slow step forward. "Only the outcome." He moved like a panther. Before Flint or Cutter could react, Chayton had closed the distance. He didn't attack Silas. Instead, he spun the butt of his knife, slamming into Cutter's temple. The big man dropped like a sack of grain. Flint drew a pistol, but Chayton was already moving, kicking the gun from his hand and delivering a disabling blow to his arm that made the man howl in pain. It was over in seconds. Silas stood, frozen, his hand still clamped on Ilara's arm, his drunken bravado evaporating into sheer shock. Chayton now stood before him, the knife held steady, its point aimed at Silas's throat. "I will say it one more time," Chayton whispered, the sound more menacing than any shout. "Let her go." Slowly, contemptuously, Silas released Ilara's arm. She scrambled away, her whole body shaking. "This isn't over!" Silas hissed, his eyes full of hatred. "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life, savage. This town will see you hang." Chayton ignored him. His gaze was on Ilara, his expression softening as he checked to see if she was unharmed. "Are you hurt?" "No," she breathed. "Thank you." The sound of running footsteps and shouts from the street broke the tension. The commotion had drawn a crowd. Jacob came bursting in his face, pale with horror at the scene. "What in God's name?" "He attacked her," Chayton said, simply gesturing with his knife toward Silas. But the crowd didn't see a rescue. They saw a white woman disheveled and an armed Lakota man standing over 2 injured white men. The marshal, a portly, indecisive man named Blevins, pushed his way through. "What's the meaning of this, Chayton?" Blevins demanded, his hand hovering over his gun. "He's a mad dog, Marshal," Silas shouted, seizing the opportunity. "He came in here, attacked my men and threatened me, tried to... Take the girl." The crowd murmured, their faces hardening. They were ready to believe the worst. Ilara saw the noose tightening, not just around Chayton, but around herself and her uncle. Silas had trapped them in a ring of fire. "That's a lie," Ilara cried out, her voice ringing with conviction. "Silas attacked me, Chayton saved me." But her words were just whispers against the roar of their prejudice. The marshal looked from Chayton's knife to Ilara's frightened face to Silas's feigned outrage. He chose the path of least resistance. "Drop the knife, Chayton," Blevins said, finally drawing his pistol. "You're under arrest." Chayton's eyes met Ilara's. In them she saw no fear, only a deep, sorrowful understanding of how this world worked. He looked at the hate-filled faces surrounding them, and then back at her. With a quiet grace, he lowered his knife and dropped it to the dirt floor. He had saved her, and in doing so, had sacrificed himself to the mob. The cell they threw Chayton into was a dank cage at the back of the marshal's office, little more than a closet with bars. Silas Blackwood, ever the magnanimous victim, declared he wouldn't press charges for a hanging, not yet. He wanted Chayton to suffer to be made an example of. The trial Marshal Blevins announced would be in 3 days. It was a farce. There would be no justice, only the foregone conclusion of a town eager to exercise its hatred. Ilara was frantic. "We have to do something," she pleaded with Jacob as they sat in the dark smithy. The fire in the forge was out. The entire place felt cold and dead. "There's nothing we can do, Ellie," Jacob said, his voice heavy with defeat. "Silas owns this town. He owns the marshal. Anyone who speaks for Chayton will be ruined or run out, or worse. So we just let them hang an innocent man, the man who saved my life. He's not innocent in their eyes," Jacob said, his head in his hands. "He's an Indian. And you're a fallen woman. To them your word is worth less than dirt." The phrase, "fallen woman," struck her like a physical blow. It was the same judgment, the same dismissal she had faced in Philadelphia. Here in this wild land, where she had hoped to escape her past, it had found her again uglier and more violent. She realized then that Jacob was right. The law would not help them. An idea desperate and dangerous took root in her mind. If the law was broken, she would have to break it herself. She waited until after midnight, when the town was sunk in a drunken stupor. She crept out of the smithy, carrying a small satchel with water-dried meat and a heavy file she had taken from the workshop. The marshal's office was dark, save for a single lamp on the desk. Blevins was asleep at his chair, a bottle of whiskey beside him, his snores rattling the windows. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she slipped inside. The key ring was on a hook by the door. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely fit the key into the lock of Chayton's cell. He was not asleep. He was standing in the shadows watching her. The lock clicked open. He stepped out, moving with his accustomed silence. He took the satchel from her, his eyes questioning. "We have to go," she whispered. "Now. They'll kill you." "And you?" he asked, his voice low. "They will know you did this." "I don't care. I won't let them murder you for saving me." He nodded once, a gesture of acceptance. There was no time for more words. He led the way, slipping out the back window and into the alley. He moved through the darkness of Deadwood like a ghost, Ilara following in his shadow, her city-bred senses screaming with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. He led her not into the open, but up into the treacherous pine-choked hills that loomed over the town. The climb was brutal. Rocks tore at her dress and scraped her hands. By the time the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky, they were miles away, hidden in a deep cleft between two massive granite formations. Below Deadwood was a scattering of smouldering campfires and distant lights, a hell she had just escaped. They found shelter in a shallow cave, screened by a curtain of ancient junipers. Chayton built a small smokeless fire with an expert's skill. He said little respecting her exhaustion, but his presence was a comforting bulwark against the vast, intimidating wilderness. For 2 days they traveled deeper into the Paha Sapa. Chayton taught her things: how to walk silently, how to find clean water, which berries were safe to eat. He spoke of the land not as a thing to be conquered, but as a living entity, with a spirit and a memory. In his world, a bent twig or a displaced stone told a story. He was more at home in this rugged wilderness than any man she had ever known in a drawing room. On the 3rd night they made camp in a hidden meadow, where a waterfall tumbled into a clear, cold pool. The moon was a silver disk in the sky, illuminating the clearing with a soft, ethereal light. The pursuit for now seemed distant. A fragile peace settled between them. They sat by the fire, the silence comfortable. Ilara found herself wanting to fill it, to bridge the gap between their worlds, to make him understand who she was. Or more accurately, who she thought she was. "In their eyes, I'm just as much of an outcast as you are," she said, softly staring into the flames. Chayton looked at her, his expression unreadable. Their eyes are blind. The weight of her past, of Alistair Croft, and the scandal pressed down on her. Here, under the honest gaze of this man who had risked everything for her, the lies and pretenses of her former life felt like a suffocating shroud. She had to tell him. He deserved the truth, even the ugly parts. "You defended my honor," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Back in the smithy. You should know that honor was already gone, long before I came to Deadwood." She took a deep, shuddering breath, the words catching in her throat. "What Silas said about me, what everyone whispers, It's not true, not the way they mean it. But I'm not. I am not what they think a good woman should be. I'm not pure. The confession hung in the air raw and painful. She finally looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears, expecting to see disappointment or pity or perhaps even disgust. She braced herself for the judgment she had always received. I'm not a virgin. She said the words a final quiet surrender of her deepest shame. Chaitan held her gaze. His face did not change. There was no shock, no condemnation. He simply reached across the small fire, his hand strong and warm, and took hers. His touch was gentle, respectful. It anchored her, pulling her back from the precipice of her own self-loathing. He held her hand for a long moment, the warmth of his skin a stark contrast to the coldness of her memories. Then he spoke, his voice as calm and steady as the ancient hills around them. I never asked you to be. The words were simple, but they struck Elara with the force of a revelation. All her life, her worth had been defined by that single fragile concept. To her father, to society, to Alistair Croft, it had been a commodity to be protected, to be bartered, to be stolen. But to Chaitan it was irrelevant. He was not looking at a pure woman or a ruined woman. He was looking at her, at Elara. In the heart of the sacred Black Hills under the light of the moon, the shame she had carried for so long finally broke. It was not her shame to carry. It was the shame of a world that had tried to define her. And for the first time she felt free. Their sanctuary in the hills was a fragile idyll. For a few days, the world was reduced to the waterfall, the stars, and the quiet understanding that had grown between them. Chaitan showed her pictographs on a hidden cliff face, telling the stories of his ancestors. Elara, in turn, told him of Philadelphia, not the glittering society, but of the books she'd read and the dreams she'd once had of seeing the world. They were from different universes, yet they found a common language in their shared solitude. But the tendrils of Deadwood were long and insidious. Back in town, Elara's disappearance and Chaitan's escape had thrown Silas Blackwood into a rage. It was a public humiliation. He put a bounty on Chaitan's head, 500 tolos, a king's ransom, that turned every greedy prospector in the territory into a potential manhunter. He also had men watching Jacob's every move, certain Elara would try to contact him. Jacob, for his part, was playing a dangerous game. Racked with guilt over his inaction, he publicly condemned his niece as a fool, bewitched by a savage, all while secretly trying to gather supplies to help her. He was a man torn, forced to wear a mask of compliance to survive. The real twist, however, did not come from a bounty hunter's bullet. It arrived on the afternoon stagecoach, a man as out of place in Deadwood as Elara had been. He was dressed in a pristine dark grey suit, his face pale, and his demeanour radiating a cold urban authority. He did not go to the hotel. He went directly to Silas Blackwood's gem saloon. The man's name was Mr. Elias Thorne, an attorney and agent for a very powerful client back east. He found Silas in his back office, brooding over a map of the Black Hills. Mr. Blackwood. Thorne began without preamble, placing a leather briefcase on the desk. I represent Mr. Alistair Croft of Philadelphia. Silas looked up, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. Never heard of him. He has heard of you, Thorne said smoothly. He understands you are a man who gets things done in this rustic territory. He also understands you have a vested interest in a young woman named Elara Vance. Silas leaned back, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. My interest just got a lot more expensive. What's it to him? Thorne opened the briefcase. It was filled with neat stacks of cash. Mr. Croft had a misunderstanding with Miss Vance before her departure. She left possessing certain letters. correspondence of a delicate nature. Not just personal, but business. Letters that detail certain fraudulent land deals and shipping ventures that could prove ruinous to Mr. Croft and his partners if they fell into the wrong hands. The lie about Ilara being a wanton girl had just been the public story. The reality was far more dangerous. Alistair Croft hadn't just assaulted her, he had misjudged her. He had been so arrogant in his advances that he had spoken carelessly of his illegal business dealings, believing her too intimidated and insignificant to understand or remember. After the assault, when she realized no one would believe her word, she had taken the only power she could. In a moment of desperate clarity, she had stolen a packet of his letters from his study. She hadn't even read them. It was a pure, instinctual act of self-preservation, a shield against him. She had them hidden in a false bottom of her valise. "She has letters," Silas said, his mind racing. This changed everything. This wasn't about a ruined reputation anymore. It was about evidence, blackmail, power. "Mr. Croft wants the letters back discreetly." Thorne continued, pushing a stack of bills forward. "And he wants Miss Vance silenced, permanently." He pushed another larger stack of bills forward. He doesn't want her returned to Philadelphia. He wants her to have an unfortunate accident in the wilderness. Blame it on her Indian companion. It would be a neat, tidy conclusion. Silas stared at the money. It was more than he could make from his best gold claim in a year. His obsession with Ilara had been about pride and possession. Now it was about cold, hard profit. He was no longer just a spurned suitor. He was a hired killer with the backing of a wealthy, ruthless man. "My bounty was for the Indian," Silas said. 500. "Mr. Croft will happily pay the bounty," Thorne said, adding another stack to the pile. "Consider it a bonus. Kill the Lakota, find the girl, retrieve the letters, and then dispose of her. Make it look tragic." Silas Blackwood began to laugh, a deep, ugly sound of pure avarice. His personal vendetta had just become the most profitable venture of his life. He now had the resources to hire not just a few drunken miners, but seasoned trackers and gunmen. He sent for a man named Jedediah Kane, a grizzled ex-cavalry scout known for his brutality during the Indian Wars and his relentless ability to track. While the posse of prospectors was blundering through the lower hills, Kane would be methodical, lethal, and silent. "Spread the word," Silas ordered his men, his voice alight with new purpose. "The bounty on the Indian stands, but the girl is to be brought to me, unharmed." He had no intention of killing her immediately, not until he had the letters and had broken her spirit completely. The unfortunate accident could wait until after he'd had his fun. The ghost of Philadelphia had reached across the continent. Ilara and Chayton, believing they were fleeing the petty hatred of a frontier town, were now being hunted by the faceless, limitless power of Eastern money and corruption. They were no longer just fugitives. They were loose ends in a conspiracy far bigger than they could ever imagine, and the professional hunter now closing in on them had no intention of letting them escape. The change in the hunt was something Chayton felt before he saw it. It was a shift in the rhythm of the wilderness. The deer were more spooked. The birds took flight with a sharper cry. The clumsy, loud prospectors who had been crashing through the underbrush for days were gone. In their place was a silence that was far more menacing. "Someone else is tracking us," he said to Ilara one morning, his eyes scanning the ridgeline above their camp. "Someone who knows the land." He had found the signs. A footprint here, a broken branch there, marks left by a man who moved with purpose and skill. The pursuit had become a lethal chess match played across miles of unforgiving terrain. Chayton pushed them harder, moving away from water sources he knew a tracker would check, leading them through difficult rocky ground where their trail would be harder to follow. The strain began to show on Ilara. Her dress was in tatters, her face was scratched and smudged with dirt, but a new resilience had taken root in her. The pampered city girl was gone, replaced by a woman who knew how to find her footing on a treacherous slope and how to ration a mouthful of water. Her bond with Chaitan deepened with every shared danger, every silent glance of understanding. They were no longer a Lakota man and a white woman. They were a single unit of survival. Meanwhile, in Deadwood, Jacob Vance was trapped. Silas's men were a constant shadow. He felt their eyes on him in the market, in the saloon, even through the open doors of his own smithy. He knew Ilara would be running low on supplies, but any move he made was scrutinized. He had to find a way to warn her, to help her. His chance came in the form of a young boy, Pip an orphan, who did odd jobs around the town. Pip was terrified of Silas, but fiercely loyal to Jacob, who often gave him food and a warm place to sleep by the forge. One evening, Jacob called the boy over. "Pip," he said, his voice a low whisper. "I need you to do something for me. It's dangerous." He handed the boy a small, tightly wrapped package and a pouch of coins. Inside the package was a chunk of salted beef, a small bag of flour, and most importantly, a folded piece of paper. On it, Jacob had sketched a crude map of the northern hills marking a location, an abandoned trapper's cabin he and Ilara had visited once years ago on a walk. He also wrote a single frantic message. "They are not just miners. A professional is hunting you. A man from back east is involved. He wants you silenced. Run." "Take this to the old northern trail," Jacob instructed, his big hands trembling as he gripped the boy's shoulders. "Leave it under the Three Sister Pines. You know the ones. Do it after dark. Tell no one. No one you understand." Pip, his eyes wide, nodded solemnly and disappeared into the night. 2 days later, Chaitan, circling back on their trail to watch their pursuer, found the package. He recognized Pip's small footprints and knew it had to be from Jacob. He brought it back to Ilara. She read the note, her blood running cold. A man from back east. It could only be Alistair Croft. The letters. He knew she had the letters. The realization hit her with sickening force. This wasn't just Silas's bruised pride. This was Croft tying up loose ends, erasing his mistakes. She was a witness he couldn't afford to let live. "He hired them," she whispered, her face pale. "Silas is working for him. To kill me." Chaitan read the message over her shoulder, his expression grim. "This hunter, Jedediah Kane. I've heard of him. He was with the soldiers at the Washita. He does not hunt for bounty. He hunts for the pleasure of the kill." The knowledge changed their flight from one of evasion to a desperate race for their lives. The abandoned cabin on Jacob's map was their only hope, a temporary shelter, a place to rest and form a new plan. They traveled through the night, pushing their exhausted bodies to the limit. As dawn broke, they saw it, a small, dilapidated cabin, nestled in a tight valley, almost invisible against the mountainside. It was a miserable place, but it offered 4 walls and a roof. As Chaitan secured the area, setting snares and watching their back trail, Ilara frantically tore open the false bottom of her valise. There they were, the packet of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Her shield. Her death warrant. She began to read them, her initial goal of simple self-preservation turning into horrified understanding. Croft wasn't just a fraud. He was conspiring with government agents to sell rotten meat and faulty rifles to the army and illegally selling reservation land to the railroad. The letters implicated not just him, but senators and businessmen. It was a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of power. If these letters ever saw the light of day, it would destroy them all. No wonder he wanted her dead. He's not just a criminal, she said to Chaitan, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. He's a monster, poisoning everything he touches, just like Silas. At that moment, the sharp crack of a rifle echoed through the valley. A splinter of wood exploded from the cabin's doorframe, inches from Ilara's head. They were pinned down. Jedediah Kane had found them. From his vantage point on the ridge above, Kane settled in. He wasn't a man to rush. He had them trapped. He had all the time in the world. He would wait for them to run out of food, out of water, out of hope. The siege had begun. Inside the cabin, with the damning letters spread on the floor, Ilara and Chaitan looked at each other. They had run as far as they could. Now they had to fight. The siege lasted for 2 days. 2 days of thirst, hunger, and the constant nerve-shredding tension of waiting for the next bullet. Jedediah Kane was a master of psychological warfare. He didn't waste ammunition. He would fire a single shot every few hours just to remind them he was there, a splintering impact on the cabin wall, a bullet thudding into the dirt just outside the door. It was a patient, cruel game. Inside, the desperation forged a new kind of resolve in Ilara. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a diamond-hard anger. These men, Croft Silas Kane, had tried to take everything from her, her reputation, her freedom, her life. They thought she was a weak, hysterical girl. They were wrong. "We cannot stay here," Chaitan said on the second night, his voice a low rasp. "The water is gone. By morning we will be too weak to fight." "So we run?" Ilara asked. "No," he said, his eyes meeting hers in the darkness. "We choose the ground. We make him come to us." He pointed to a shape on Jacob's crude map. Devil's Tooth. She remembered the place, a treacherous spire of rock and scree that Jacob had warned her about, a place of sharp drop-offs and narrow ledges. It was a death trap. It was also, Chaitan explained, defensible. A place where one person who knew the terrain could hold off 10 who didn't. Their plan was desperate. Under the cover of a moonless night, they would slip out the cabin's single rear window. Ilara would carry the empty satchel, a decoy. Chaitan would circle around, climbing above Kane's position, while Ilara made for Devil's Tooth, creating a trail for Kane to follow. "He is hunting me," Chaitan said. "His pride will make him follow you, the weaker prey, thinking I have abandoned you." "And if he catches me?" she asked, her voice steady. "He will not," Chaitan replied with a certainty that calmed her more than any promise. "Lead him to the narrow pass. I will be waiting." The escape was terrifying. Every rustle of leaves, every dislodged pebble sounded like a cannon shot in the stillness. But they made it. Ilara headed west deliberately, leaving a clear trail. As the sun rose, she heard Kane behind her. He was moving fast, confident like a wolf closing in. She reached the base of Devil's Tooth, her lungs burning her legs, screaming in protest. The pass was a narrow fissure in the rock, barely wide enough for a person to walk through. It was a natural kill box. She scrambled through it and found cover behind a jumble of boulders on the other side, her heart hammering. She clutched the heavy rock she had picked up, her only weapon. She didn't have to wait long. Jedediah Kane appeared at the mouth of the pass rifle held at the ready. He was a gaunt, hard-bitten man, with eyes as dead as stones. He saw her, and a thin, cruel smile touched his lips. He started to raise his rifle. An arrow fletched with hawk feathers materialized in his throat. He made a gurgling sound, his eyes wide with shock, and pitched forward onto the rocks. Chaitan emerged from the cliffs above his bow, in hand, his face a mask of grim necessity. But their relief was short-lived. Very impressive, a voice drawled from behind them. They spun around. Silas Blackwood stood there, a revolver in his hand, a dozen of his hired guns fanned out on the rocks around them. While Kane had tracked them, Silas had used his knowledge of the land to circle around and cut them off. "I figured my bloodhound would lead me right to you," Silas sneered, his eyes locking on Ilara. "Drop the bow, Chayton. It's over. Hand over the letters, Ilara, and then you and I are going to have a long talk." Chayton slowly lowered his bow. They were surrounded, outgunned. Hope seemed to vanish like smoke. But Ilara was no longer the frightened girl from Philadelphia. She looked at Silas at the arrogant certainty on his face, and she made a choice. She held up the packet of letters. "You want them?" "Silas," she called out, her voice clear and strong. "Come and get them." She turned and ran, not away, but along the narrow ledge of Devil's Tooth toward the sheer cliff face at its end. "No." Silas roared, panicked that she might destroy the letters, his payday. "Don't shoot her. Get her." He and his men scrambled after her, their heavy boots slipping on the loose rock. The chase was clumsy and chaotic. This was Chayton's chance. In the confusion, he moved like a phantom, a knife in his hand. He took out 2 of Silas's men from behind before they even knew he was there. The others, distracted by Ilara, were easy targets for his arrows. Ilara reached the end of the ledge. Below her was a 1,000-foot drop. She was trapped. Silas cornered her, his face flushed with rage and triumph. "Nowhere left to run, little bird." He gasped, lunging for her. "You're right," she said, and with a defiant cry, she threw the packet of letters out into the abyss. Silas screamed in fury, his greed overcoming his caution. He lunged instinctively for the fluttering papers, his feet slipping on the crumbling edge. For a moment he teetered there, his eyes wide with terror. He scrabbled for a handhold, but there was nothing. With a final choked cry, he fell tumbling into the empty air. The remaining gunmen, seeing their leader gone, and Chayton picking them off from the rocks, lost their nerve. They broke and ran, melting back into the wilderness. Silence descended on Devil's Tooth, broken only by the wind whistling through the rocks. Ilara stood on the ledge, shaking her knuckles white. Chayton came to her side. "The letters," he said, his voice quiet. Ilara reached into the bodice of her tattered dress and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. It was the most damning letter of all, the one detailing Croft's dealings with a U.S. senator. She had gambled that Silas's greed would make him reckless, that he wouldn't stop to count the pages. "I kept one," she said, a weary but triumphant smile touching her lips. "A monster like Croft should not be allowed to hide in the shadows. He needs to be brought into the light." They had survived. They had won. But their fight was far from over. They never went back to Deadwood. With Jacob's help, they sent the letter, not to a corrupt marshal, but to a crusading journalist in Cheyenne, a man known for his hatred of government corruption. The resulting scandal was explosive, ruining Alistair Croft and his powerful associates, a reckoning delivered from the heart of the wild frontier. Ilara Vance, the ruined woman, had toppled an empire of deceit with a single piece of paper and an unbreakable will. She and Chayton found their own path. They built a life far from the greed of the gold rush towns and the judgment of so-called civilization. Their world wasn't an easy one, fraught with the dangers of the land and the prejudice of the times. But it was theirs. They found their home, not in a place, but in each other. Ilara learned that her worth was not defined by her past, and Chayton, who had always walked between worlds, finally found one where he truly belonged. Their story became a quiet legend in the Black Hills, a testament to the fact that true sanctuary is found in acceptance, and true honor is not about purity, but about the courage to fight for the person you love. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the Old West. The story of Ilara and Chaitan is a reminder that history is filled with quiet heroes and unspoken acts of courage. If their story of defiance and acceptance moved you, please let us know by hitting that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a story with real heart and grit. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We have so many more lost tales from history to share with you, and we wouldn't want you to miss a single one. Thank you for listening.